Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now in our 22nd episode of 2022. But before we kick off, I'd like to thank the sponsors of Fiber for Breakfast, including our gold sponsors, CHR Solutions, Millennium, and Plume, and our silver sponsor, Graybar. Last week, the FCC approved another 88 RDOF winners, which were largely fiber projects from rural operators and utility providers. Thankfully, the FCC has not approved any Starlink locations, and I suspect that Elon Musk's long-form applications will never see the light of day. So thank you, FCC, for that. The FCC also announced tutorials to help network operators file verified broadband availability data for the inaugural broadband data collection filing window that opens on June 30th. All facility-based providers of fixed and mobile broadband must submit their broadband availability data through the broadband data collection no later than September 1, 2022. As you all know, this is really critically important because this will really determine the allocation of the broadband infrastructure money, the BEAD money. Fiber Connect now is only 11 days away and will be held in Nashville, June 12th to 15th. Registrations already surpassed last year's record attendance, and our content is phenomenal with over 200 speakers and 170 sessions. If you haven't registered, please do so as soon as possible because we're going to have to close registrations when we reach our capacity. This will be the biggest and best broadband event in the world this year. You're not going to want to miss it. That brings us to today's Fiber for Breakfast session, where we'll be focused on the middle mile. What you don't know can hurt you. But before I formally introduce today's guests, I'd like to introduce Trish Ehlers from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thanks, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us today. Before I go over a few logistical items, I'd like to once again thank our Fiber for Breakfast sponsors, Gold sponsor, CHR Solutions, Millennium, and Plume, and Silver sponsor, Graybar. Now, if you'd all keep in mind that everyone's in listen mode only today. To ask a question, just type it into the question box located within your control panel on the right side of your screen. We'll host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's webinar. This presentation is being recorded and will be available to members only on FBA's website within 24 hours. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of the presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a very brief feedback survey. We'd really appreciate it if you'd take a minute to do so. We very much value your input. And now I'll pass it back to Gary to introduce our panelists and get us started. Gary?
Thanks, Trish, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week in Fiber for Breakfast, we met with my old friends, Jack Burton and Dave Strauss of Broadband Success Partners, and discussed their battle scars in a session titled The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, what we've learned from 30+ network evaluations. Jack and David have definitely seen their fair share of networks and highlighted what you need to do to get ready for a network evaluation when you're raising money or preparing for a merger or acquisition. Today, our guest is Rick Talbot, Principal Analyst at ACG Research, and we're going to be discussing the middle mile. What you don't know can hurt you. Rick is the Principal Analyst at ACG Research for the Intelligent Optical Networking and 5G RAN and XHAL practices. Combines with expertise in network access, transport, particularly optical networking, and switching technologies, including software-defined networking, and the deep understanding of the telecommunications industry, competitive landscape, business, and regulatory issues and economic trends to provide a comprehensive view of the industry. He's gained this broad experience in over 40 years of technical marketing and sales engineering roles at network system vendors, as well as network architecture design roles at service providers. Rick holds an MBA from SMU and is a Bachelor of Engineering Science degree from Trinity University. He's a registered professional engineer in the state of Texas and a senior member of the IEEE. Welcome, Rick. And for audience, please type in your questions as we go for a Q&A session at the end. I think this session is definitely going to have a lot of questions, so start typing those in. With that, Over to you, Rick.
Okay, thanks so much. Yes, very happy to be with you all this morning and to talk about middle mile. And I guess the regulatory things are always on our minds at top with respect to funding. But let's take a look at just the general concept first of what middle mile is. So what I'd like to do is just start off with the concept of, let's say, 3 different areas. Okay, and on the left-hand side, you have a city, and you see that there's a, it's a big cloud network there. The core network cloud has a lot of different equipment in a process of changing from primarily hardware, very purpose-driven equipment to more of a server type of equipment. Then in the rest of the area, you have like maybe small towns, that's like in the middle. And then on the right-hand side, that represents the rural areas. We have defined for us 2 different classifications of locations with respect to broadband service. There are some who are unserved, and that shows on the right-hand side. And by definition, that means in definition set by the federal government, that unserved is you don't have as high as 25 megabits per second downstream and 3 megabits per second upstream that you can send. Then in the middle is the concept of underserved. And underserved is you don't have 100 megabits per second coming down. No one provides that, or 20 megabits per second going up, upstream. Okay, so those are the definitions, and that's what we have. So many areas that don't have it. Now I know there's a completely different topic of economic capability of affording broadband, and the government has programs specifically for that, for instance, within the city. So right now I'm just addressing the government programs to address geographic areas that don't have enough broadband. So let's go to the next slide and see, once again, we're building to the concept of what middle mile is, okay? So in this slide, the heavier lines represent the fact that, okay, fine, you can get broadband in the areas that were underserved before and unserved before, and they're still out there in out there in the country. And if they operate just by themselves, that doesn't give them very much value. They still need to be able to get connected into the capital I internet, into the core of the network. So it's a second step, and that's the definition of middle mile that we're going for here. So in the next slide, just very simply diagrammatically showing that the concept of middle mile is to bring in that traffic that's generated there, and then of course to give access to send the traffic back out to the locations. Now, having defined what the concept of middle mile is, let's take a look at what the federal government has done for us. And right now it's being administered by the NTIA, okay? There are 2 programs, and you're probably familiar, and you've heard it more and more and more, particularly the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, the BEAD program. That's the one that gave the remote locations the capability of providing broadband out to their subscribers. $45 billion program. It's for both unserved and underserved locations, but the priority starts off with unserved. And then another aspect, when you hear, sometimes it's described from a network standpoint as last mile. And that's where we end up with a separate concept of middle mile, is last mile and middle mile. So the BEAD program is addressing last mile. We always think of already, telecommunications companies, service providers who would be what we call, and what the government calls, eligible entities. These are the ones who are going to receive the funds and deploy the networks. But it's not only that. Communities can do it, institutions can do it, states can do it, counties can do it. So there's a fairly wide definition there which also means, and this reflects back on the concept of middle mile, is that some of these are not familiar with connecting back to the rest of the world. So they're going to get funds to deploy broadband networks in their area, community, whatever. But there is another topic, another expertise required, and that is connecting to the rest of the world. And that's where, once again, the middle mile comes in. One last aspect of this is multiple access technologies are allowed. They, in the statute and now in the rules that the NTIA has put out, there can be different ways to do it, but of course you have to be able to provide the services themselves. Once again, 100 meg downstream, 20 meg upstream, and you have to do it with meet latency requirements. And I'm not talking about terribly strict ones, but there are requirements that do prevent you from using some technologies that would load down almost immediately when people got on. It's like if you had a, let's say, you had 100 megabit radio, so that the first person who gets on can get 100 megabits per second. You can't say that's 100 megabit because when the second person gets on, you don't have 100 megabits anymore. So this is the type of thing that the NTIA and the FCC are looking at. Then, as we say, there's middle mile program, and happily the government recognized this, and they have created this middle mile broadband infrastructure program, which is $1 billion. So yeah, quite a bit less than that. It's to encourage, and the wording is interesting, encourage deployment of middle mile networks, and the idea of connect the unserved and underserved areas to the internet backbone. That's the way they say it. And another aspect of it is, and this is, I guess shows some insight, and that is promote resiliency through the creation, and these are my words, network diversity. In other words, back in the back in the older days, you had a rural town. If you had a flood that knocked out the cable that was the main cable of that town, those phones couldn't get out until the cable was repaired. There was almost always just one. It was just a tree, and you cut that branch, and that's it. The government wants to avoid that. It wants to have this network diversity. And finally, another interesting aspect of it is that they want to, the middle mile provider, so now not the end provider who's using the B program, they want the middle mile provider to provide gigabit Ethernet to anchor institutions. And this would be symmetric Ethernet. So, when you're envisioning putting this infrastructure out, if you get relatively close to some anchor institution, what are anchor institutions? Well, they're like colleges, or maybe a county government if it's built up. Things like this. There's a responsibility with that. Now, the red line at the bottom. The money is going to be made available, but there still has to be a selection of who gets that money. And so there's going to be competition for that funding. And the competition is on the basis of a set of rules. And they have a specific set of rules, one for B and the other for MMG. And there are things like, you really are serving, and once again, higher priority was the unserved. You have to show that you have capability of doing it. So you need to have, it helps to be there a long time. You've got to have the technical capability also. So let's go on to the next slide here, because now I'm going to show a diagrammatic picture of what these things imply. And once again, the reason for it, the function of the middle mile. If we take a look at the left-hand side, there you've got the kind of the existing network, right? And I call it metro access network. The concept is it's close enough to a metro to be connected to it. What I intend in the representation is this is an edge office in that metro, but it'll have fiber, that's the ring you see on top, to cell towers and businesses, and of course, they also can launch residential access from that, but also, and more importantly here, residential access most often really comes directly from the end office, and it's coming out in the classic example is passive optical networking. Okay, so you got a PON infrastructure. You can only get so far out with the PON infrastructure. Sometimes it is not fiber all the way. Sometimes it's to copper at the very end. So you'd have either hybrid fiber coax if that's a cable operator who's doing it, or you've got ADSL, what I call XDSL, all sorts of flavors of DSL. Now we've got the new locations that have the broadband access on the right-hand side. That remote access is in areas that are beyond the reach. And this is the important thing, it's beyond the reach of the central office. And these services and these architectures normally would have been taken all the way back to the central office, just longer lines going out. But that dashed line there indicates, hey, this is as far as you can reach out. So now we're going to have networks built at these remote locations, and you're going to need to have enough capacity to bring that traffic back, number one. Number two, you want resiliency. The NTIA is going to demand that you have some kind of, basically a protection route. And that's the reason why I've got this drawn as a, kind of a ring. Okay, yeah, square. And then finally, the third thing, if you look at the bottom, there's your anchor institution being served on the middle mile coming back. That's supposed to be a college campus there. So let's go on to the next slide. So here are the requirements on the middle mile network. Okay, so now I'm just going to focus on the middle mile. First of all, the services. It's going to be transporting a very wide mix of traffic. And the first thing, and I didn't say it specifically here, but the implication is clear that, hey, it's going to carry a lot more traffic than what was being carried before. This is broadband traffic. So the capacity is going to need to be significantly larger than what you normally would bring back, okay? So you're supporting residential legacy and broadband services on that. You're also supporting your radio access network traffic, which means mid-haul connections, which are between the distributed units and central units in the radio access network. And at this point, I could go into a description of what radio access networks look like, and I'm not going to do that, but just to say, those connections have to be served across this. And then backhaul connections also. The backhaul connections have been there, but as we have deployment of broadband networks out at the edge of the network, there are going to be additional microcells and small cells deployed out at those locations, because now they can get the traffic back. And the middle mile network is going to have to support that, as well as business services, and then once again, gigabit Ethernet to anchor institutions. That's the traffic it needs to. Now, from a competitive standpoint, once again, it's important to be efficient. And so you need to be able to terminate all of the service types, or let's say architectures that you have out in the field. So all of your GPON, you've got to terminate your XGS PON. And when I say terminate, that's out at the far end to take these connections into your middle mile network. For the MSOs, it's going to be fiber coax coming in. Also, just keep in mind, and this is one thing that can surprise you, is there are new formats being considered for very high speed or broadband connections. The PAM4, for instance, is like going out to cell towers sometimes. You could come out with a PAM4 being an inexpensive way to reach out over fiber and provide high capacities out to them. There are new coherent 100G wavelengths and gray optics to support that. And also a new item being introduced called XR optics, which basically takes a DWDM signal, splits it up into subcarriers, and broadcasts that. It's really a broadcast network. And so for the first time, you have to consider you may need to manage some kind of a broadcast network through the fiber network. So let's go to the next slide. So what kind of tools do you have this? These are going to be new too, okay? So obviously we just have time for kind of an introduction. But let me just quickly run through some of the types of equipment that you'll have as options, okay? First of all, the transport vendors are coming up with what I call multi-service transport platforms. These are platforms that have a tremendous amount of capacity over the middle mile. It looks like it is an entire central office at that location, literally, where you would have a card before that would be your OLT. Now it's just a single plug in here in this type of box that's a full OLT. You used to have specialized equipment to terminate front haul. Well, there's a plug that does front haul also. So the box does a lot of different things, so it allows you to do this in a small space with one piece of equipment. That's one way to handle those terminations. Another way to handle the terminations is with a router, and for that very high capacity coming back, the transport vendors have said, well, if you're going to use a router to terminate those lines, we have a very inexpensive, simply transport piece of equipment to do it that we call a compact modular transport system. And then we have the router vendors say, well, I don't even need that transport equipment. We have new coherent, pluggable optical modules you can plug in, and just coming out, that'll give you the wavelength you need. So you don't even need a separate transport piece of equipment. And finally, since a lot of these services look like cloud services being extended out to the edge, you could actually have a server out there. The server would have to have an acceleration card on it, which enables it to handle the actual line speed of some of these services. And you put those modules in, the coherent modules that the routers use, and just that conceivably could eliminate the need for separate routers out there. So you have a lot of technical decisions to make as you start deploying middle mile networks. From an operational standpoint, now you've got to fight the complexity of all these different solutions, okay? It's going to be software networking. You're going to need what we call multi-domain orchestration. If you have what we call separate domains, that is separate vendors doing these different functions. You have to have something that's going to tie those together. In addition to that, since your physical aggregation is like an access network, but the transport and switching of it is separate elements that might be doing that. That's called multi-layer orchestration. That is, you have lower layers doing part of it you have to control, and then higher layers in the ISO model, how you control it, they have to be orchestrated, okay? That leads me to the last point, and that is, and it's the point of this slide, is that this is presenting you with a complexity trade-off. You have the ability to put some equipment out there that does many different things, but if you have them from multiple vendors, you're going to have this multi-domain and multi-layer orchestration. That's a lot of software control and interfacing for the network to get it to work from an end-to-end basis. That's a complexity. But that's a complexity that you're considering rather than staffing all of these remote locations with, rather than kind of the ma and pa thing of just the local telephone subscribers. Now you've got whole broadband businesses and cellular business and all these different network needs that take a high degree of expertise. Are you going to put all these people out there, or even in the central locations have a lot of people who are manually managing these systems? Well, that's the other complexity. So there's your trade-off: complexity of equipment or complexity of having a lot of people trying to do all of this. So those are the challenges. That's the gotchas of the middle mile network. And Gary, we can go to questions now.
Well, Rick, you make that sound fairly complex. I thought the whole intent of SDN was to simplify and just kind of aggregate away for, or I guess kind of get rid of all the complexity. So why wouldn't we treat, this middle mile networks just as interoffice transport?
Well, and that is, that's what has happened here is that in middle mile, a regular transport, interoffice transport, particularly back in the quote old days, there were only a limited number of items that did processing of the signal. I mean, it was basically you were transporting the signal or transporting channels of the signal or switching of the signal in some way, which would be the routers. So everything that you were transporting, it was just traffic. It was just kind of vanilla. On the other hand, when you're working with the middle mile, you are transporting services and types of connections that are have a lot more complexity to them in order to save this expense of trying to manage all of these locations out at remote locations where you don't have very many people. So this complexity of services and the kind of one-to-N type situation, in sites on the end, is much more complex. So that's why you need to put the extra effort into the middle mile.
Any examples of XR optics in the wild, or can we get lessons learned? What is it? Get lessons learned from?
Well, right now, there are a couple of POCs working out in the field, and these are generally, kind of, behind the vendors doing it. And I mean, it's no secret the first vendor that's introduced that is Infinera, but we've created an industry association of people who work with this, because there are a lot of local exchange carriers who are interested in that concept to leverage the concept of putting so much capacity on wavelength division multiplexing on the fiber itself, and being able to split that up inexpensively and get a lot of capacity out to far locations. So that's a reason why you do that. So there are some trials going on right now. There's an association that is tracking it and coming up with kind of industry standard ways of going about that. And once again, the reason to do that is, I guess to say it, make kind of the same way. You put these cell towers out, small cells, and instead of being 1 or 2 T1s to run out to them, you need more than 10 gigabits per second in a number of cases. And once you go above 10 gigabits per second, the next step in the hierarchy is 100 gigabits per second, and that's overkill. So this new technology gives you this granularity to do it in either 25 gigabit per second or potentially 12.5 gigabit per second steps for that capacity.
I had a number of questions, and I don't know if this is in your expertise, but about the middle mile grant proposals. So one was, are they going to be handled directly with NTIA or coordinated with the state BEAD subgrants?
Still
through the states. What's that?
Still through the states. As far as I know, I was getting that.
I think you applied, when I look at the BEAD, I mean the NOFO for the middle mile, it looks like that it's managed by NTIA. But I had to think there's some coordination. I can get that to Tom and have.
Okay, because I was also seeing that there was a certain amount per state that was being handled on that. So yeah,
someone else just chimed in. I believe when I looked at NOFO, it says that NTI handles the middle mile. And then there are some other questions on, do you have a feel for how detailed engineering needs to be included in the middle mile proposal? And then there was one on if you have a phase 3, the small business innovation research for a preferred contractor, does that help a municipality achieve MMG grant funding? I don't know if you know any of those. I can have Tom Cohen respond.
It goes back to how much. Obviously, the answer is yes. Does it help? But I think the meaning behind it is how much does it help? and that's one that the NTIA has stated what the most important things were. They've really put priorities on these, and in some cases actually put a point system on it to come up with a numerical answer.
Yeah, and then the last question here, we're running out of time. Are you saying that the middle mile providers will need to make sure they build middle mile to accommodate multi-service transport platforms?
No, that's kind of the other way around. What I'm saying is that the middle mile has to transport multiple services, and the provider needs to decide what is the most cost-effective way to do that and the most manageable way to do that. You've got the upfront investment, and then you have the operations on an ongoing basis, and that may lead to a multi-service box at the end, or it may lead to a router solution at the end, or it could lead to a server solution at the end. Those are each a possibility. So it's not that the middle mile has to is driven by what was decided there, but the middle mile, particularly for the middle mile itself, has to decide how it wants to handle the aggregation of those services.
Well, hey, Rick, thanks so much. Really appreciate you sharing your insights and research with our audience. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today and look forward to getting back together next Wednesday. We're going to be discussing how 1 gigabit became the global standard for broadband with my good friend and Montana resident, Jamie Linderman from Omdia. So you're not going to want to miss that. We will see you guys next Wednesday.
Okay, thanks so much.